So I'd like all of you to give me your pitch for, if you think about these different four ways in which climate change and the economy interact, and you think about our ability to ensure economic prosperity worldwide over the next decades and beyond, are you optimists or are you pessimists, and why? Let's start here with His Excellency, Sebastian.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think that climate change, that we can tackle climate change just from the environmental point of view. I'm perhaps pessimistic in that regard, but the good part of this story is that renewables, that is one of the, of course, most interesting ways for tackling climate change, is already with us, and not due just from a romantic point of view or environmental point of view, but it is economically feasible. And that means that is anyway interesting the approach that we have from the economic point of view to renewables, in this case for tackling the climate change. So basically, I might be pessimistic in the way that just due to environmental principle we cannot tackle that, but renewables, which is perhaps the most effective way for tackling that, is already with us. So it's a matter of fact of how to spread out this around the world and how to do it in as fast as possible, basically.
Very well. So we have a half-half. How about Dr. Axel?
Well, I would equally say that the glass is half full and half empty. And we see here in these halls the unexpected progress of renewable energy. If you would have been here 10 years ago, there would not have been this massive number of enterprises engaging in solar energy and wind energy. And one can really say that this has gone beyond expectations. We are far more advanced than we thought just 5-10 years ago. So this is really very encouraging. But I'm also shocked about the negative climate change impacts of new technologies. For example, if you look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin mining currently uses more electricity than a middle-sized European country. And this has been equally unexpected, and therefore I think we need to be very careful about trends like the Internet of Things that need massive electricity flows, or also the driverless vehicles. We don't know whether they will actually decrease transportation energy use. Moreover, I think, and my experience of 20 years has shown it, that policymakers always like to make big declaration 20, 30 years in the future, but when it comes to setting up policy instruments right now, this is much more difficult. I'm taking my own country, Germany, where I come from. Internationally, Germany is seen as one of the pioneers of climate policy. But on the other hand, Germany is still running 50-year-old coal power plants at full capacity. No power plant in the Gulf region has such a low efficiency as those German power plants. And therefore, I would think if these savvy entrepreneurs we see in these halls are to really run their businesses and fulfill the promise, they need much more support by the policy entrepreneurs. And the policy frameworks are what will make or break the climate challenge.
Well, I'm starting to get worried here. Elizabeth?
I'm going to break it. I am an optimist at all counts. And I actually have views on some of the things that were said, but I will stick to 1 minute that we were given for this. One, I'm an optimist because against all odds, we managed to have a Paris Agreement. It is a long-term objective. It sets some sort of a vision that we can all align behind. The second, we see that alignment slowly happening in the private sector in the way the markets are moving. I work in renewable energy, but so I think I wake up in the morning, it's a wonderful story and it's a positive sector, so I'm probably sheltered from some of the things that would make me a pessimist. But certainly in our sector, you see this innovation that is snowballing and changing everything and affecting sectors beyond any expectation, and I think none of us know what's going to happen tomorrow. And the third part of my optimism is based on the shifting mindset. And we had a discussion around it just before this panel, and it's probably differing in different parts of the world. But you see with younger generations both a sense of responsibility in the context of climate that is emerging, that comes from education and a greater awareness, but also ingenuity of inventing with new technologies, that what we see in Asia and Africa, especially in off-grid settings, that the new things emerging and innovation is happening at the young generations and new opportunities emerging. So these three things together, they make me an optimist.
Fantastic. So there are areas of hope, and there is hope in people. And Michael, how about you?
I'm a huge optimist, with a caveat. I'll get to the caveat. The caveat's quite a big one, but I'm a huge optimist, because if you take a step back from just the issue of climate or what's happening in the halls here and renewable energy, then you see that the world is in general on a massively improving path. With better health, with better maternal health, with more kids going to school, with hundreds of millions being pulled out of poverty. The last presentation, the gentleman talking about, that in Asia now people have the expectation that they will fly, and that all sorts of things. This is an incredible time to be alive, and it's we are fed a steady diet of disaster. Partly by people who don't believe it, but partly by, it's kind of, if you look at the data, it's absolutely clear that the world is a great place to be and it's getting better. Then you look at the specific issues that we face, and right now plastic in the oceans is very much in focus. Historically, we are incredibly good at dealing, we as a species, as a community, we deal with problems when they become apparent. So the problem of plastic in the oceans is now front and center, and we see British government, other governments taking action, entrepreneurs taking action, scientists taking action. We will crack that problem, I've absolutely no doubt. When it comes to climate change, it's much more difficult, and it's more difficult, the only reason it's different is that there are some terrible, terrible lags in the system. By the time it's absolutely unequivocally clear that climate change is happening and it's going to be ugly, it will be too late to stop it. And that's just the physics of how long the gases stay in the atmosphere and so on. And that is, of course, a huge source of worry, because you can't just say, oh, I've identified a problem, we've all identified a problem, now we run the clock backwards. It doesn't work. Climate change doesn't work like that. We are doing incredibly well with parts of the solution, renewable energy, incredibly well, energy efficiency, miraculously well, considering how poor the policy environment has been. But, electricity is only 20-something% of energy, and that's only 60% of the problem. So we can all celebrate this amazing progress on renewable energy and even energy efficiency. Now we're seeing transport starting to go, but we have huge blocks of the problem that we've barely started on. I think we will start on them. I think we will succeed, but I don't think we'll do it fast enough for some ugly stuff to happen.
Great. Thank you. So climate change, what I'm hearing is climate change is a back-of-the-mind issue, but we should be optimists for the sake of having a self-fulfilling prophecy. Rudolf, are you an optimist or pessimist?
I am very much an optimist, but not predictively. I've been doing scenario planning, as you mentioned, for 20 years, and what you learn from looking at the world as a system from different perspectives very clearly is that by far the most important variable in any equation is human agency. Trends, by the way, and our excellent speaker introduced us so well to them, and I do a lot of trends work myself, they're crucial. But in fact, what is decisive in any human outcome is human agency. And economic discourse, even some scientific discourse, tends to underestimate it because it's difficult to measure, but it's crucial. So because I believe in human agency and I've witnessed its importance empirically, I'm an optimist. But that's not predictively, because I think, and by the way, I'm so thrilled that no one on the panel has voiced this opinion, because it's very popular these days. I call it a fetish. And the fetish that technology by itself is evolving in a way that is going to solve all of our problems. And really, we just need to kick back and relax and watch technology do its magic to the world. I think this is a terribly pernicious perspective, because there's so much hard work to do institutionally, in the policy landscape, to make this work. One final thought on why I'm a non-predictive optimist, is that just as there has been an explosion of challenges, none more important in my view in the long range than climate change, there is also, as many have mentioned, an explosion in solutions. So the DNA of tools, of policy solutions, of marrying technology to policy design has never been richer. So the tools are there, human agency is there, but political dysfunction and another basically institutional, political, historical factors get in the way. To the extent we can overcome those, I'm sure we'll solve it.
Fantastic, thank you. What I hear is human agency is a cause for optimism, but we shouldn't, there's no space for complacency. I guess the jury's out there. We have both causes for optimism and pessimism, but definitely the urgency is there. Let's now drill a bit deeper into the areas of expertise of each of our panelists. I'd like to start with you, Michael. You mentioned that the world is on an improving path. You mentioned there's some areas of technology where we'll have difficulties in terms of getting into a low carbon, zero carbon economy, clean energy mix. How far do you think is technology development going to take us? How far will advances in technology save us from climate change?
So, let's just start with the electricity piece, because I've opened a can of worms by saying it's not just electricity. But on the electricity side of things, it's already pretty darn clear what the future looks like. And that is, we're going to move to a system. We've now got to the point where country after country has got 25, 30, 40% renewable energy. That includes hydro and so on. Variable renewables is now 5, 10, 15%, growing fast. The systems are resilient. The costs are maybe higher per unit, but and then there's smart technologies that are being deployed that are bringing, opening up energy efficiency opportunities. It's pretty clear we're going to go to 60, 70% at least of renewable energy fairly quickly, and so electricity is decarbonizing. There are unknowns. We could see a breakthrough in small modular nuclear reactors or something that's going to accelerate that. But the baseline progress in electricity is already, extremely heartening. I think then you start to look at transportation, and it's going to electrify, and that's very heartening as well. We've got questions around shipping and aviation. I suspect there's going to be technological breakthroughs in terms of synthetic fuels, some stuff that will surprise us there. The really difficult ones are the basic ones of heat and industrial processes, where there hasn't been the level of focus or innovation. There's a lot of capital already deployed in our housing stock, in our offices, in our factories. And that one, it's not as clear that technology, in fact, but you know what? We don't even need technology for a lot of that. We could just build better or retrofit with existing technologies. We just have to have in a sense, the economic will to do so, and we could do so. So technology either exists or it's going to be there.
Very well. Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Sebastian, I think this economic will, political will, takes us very nicely to a question to you, which is what is the role of policy, regulation, regulatory frameworks in helping us move to a cleaner energy mix? I know your country has gone through some really interesting experiences in terms of de-risking finance and supporting investment. Could you perhaps share that experience and see and explore whether there's a potential for scaling that up and implementing it elsewhere?
Yeah, of course, my pleasure. I mean, it is critical. I mean, what we know is that we must put a good legal framework in place in order to allow for long-term investment to happen. Basically, as we've seen before, almost 3/4 of the world is even paradoxically what is going on, because it's very difficult for structuring long-term investment in almost 3/4 of the world because of the country's risk. And since renewables, as one of the most interesting industries for tackling climate change, we are talking about advance payments. I mean, everything should be invested in advance in this regard. The long-term view for getting into very good values in competitive way without subsidies with the rest of the sources is crucial. So in this sense, what we have implemented is a long-term infrastructure program, which is basically a program that we shielded out of the Argentinian risk that might be replicated on a global scale. I mean, again, more than 2/3, almost 3/4 of the globe are experiencing similar conditions of a quite hostile investment environment. And we put it in the capital market, basically. So that was through a quite interesting structure of warranties, providing even a AAA warranty at the end of the stream, using, in this case, the World Bank support for structuring this. That was even very, very cheap even for the projects, and it was amazing. In just a few months, we achieved investment-grade economist values. Even in Argentina, that for almost everybody was almost impossible to invest for the long term. So basically 20 years PPA nominated in dollars with this structure, and the results were really amazing. In just a few months, we received more than 8 times oversubscription in an auction system with prices that went down 70% of the value that we faced before, 5 months. And nobody believed that this is something that might be possible in a country like the one we received as soon as we took office 2 years ago. So the message is that this is absolutely feasible. It would be a dream to see countries around the world that paradoxically are those that have the best resource in renewables. So the best radiation, the best wind resource are happening around the world on countries that are paying $150, $200 megawatt hour, and that's ridiculous. And that's only due to the fact that they cannot structure long term. So it's key to understand how to implement a long-term structures on every single country on Earth to implement 20 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years view, and to foster the investment confidence around the world. This is happening right now in Argentina in a fantastic way, and I encourage the rest, the agencies and the world to copy or even to make a progress on structures like this, because this is absolutely feasible.
And that's a true success story there of how much one government or how much a government can do in a very short period of time with a future-oriented outlook. Elizabeth, you mentioned that one of your causes of optimism is the Paris Agreement. Irina has done studies that I would be very interested to hear, and I'm sure the audience would as well, on the implementation of the Paris Agreement and its economic impacts. I'm sure there's both costs and benefits. What are the opportunities? What are the costs?
So it's really picking up on what we have heard from others until now. We looked under the G20 presidency of Germany. We looked at what is the possible pathway to 2050 to decarbonize energy sector, and that talking about the power and end use sectors, as Michael rightly pointed out. To make I need to take this off, so because I can hear myself, so it's very disturbing. We looked at we took the real energy plans that exist today, and what are the possible pathways to 2050 with the realistic potential of renewable energy. So there are few things that to highlight. Number one, that you cannot look at renewables without efficiency. It's absolutely indispensable, because otherwise you're chasing your tail on energy demand. We can do it 90% with renewables and efficiency mix by 2050 in all sectors, end-use sectors as well as the power sector. And perhaps the most encouraging part is the economic part of it. So while the costs will be significant, then there is a requirement to shift completely the patterns of investment. The ultimate outcome would be 0.8% addition to the global GDP. but GDP does not capture all the benefits that come from this shift. We would have a massive shift in employment. At present, we have about 10 million jobs in renewable energy. We believe with this shift, we will have about 26 million jobs in 2050. That the impact on health, the GHG reductions, and the rest of welfare issues would be about a 4% increase addition to the global GDP in welfare. So there is no bad story in this. It's just a matter of political will and adjustment, and that picks up on the second part what Sebastian was talking about in the responsibility of policymakers. And the second piece of work that we have done that I think is incredibly important and interesting is we looked at NDCs and we looked what countries have put in their NDCs. And we looked at the renewable energy part, obviously, and we added them all up, and it turns out that out of almost 200 parties to the Paris Agreement, only about 140 put renewable energy in their NDCs, and only about 100 put the quantifiable targets in the NDCs. And we know that 173 countries have some target of policy in place in their energy plans. So we're like, oh, this is not really, it's a little bit inconsistent. So we started aggregating, looking at energy plans. And so what we found was that, number one, the NDCs are not reflecting the energy plans. So even there is a discrepancy. So the message that is coming out of NDCs is not really reflecting what's happening on the ground. So the policy making is better than what we have in NDCs. But perhaps the most striking finding of this study was that what policymakers have in their plans is actually not following the market. The market today is better than what you see in energy plan for 2030. So it is a very powerful message, and it is something that we probably should do in some other sectors to get a better sense. So we then don't get caught up on this NDC negative message, oh, wow, we're going to have 4 degrees and then nothing's going to happen. We really need to start having real data, real empirical evidence that shows real life and what's happening in the world so that we can shape policies accordingly and have a greater alignment between what's happening in markets and policymakers.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that really highlights the importance of political signaling and the messages sent to investors. The NDCs being the plans that each country develops based on their national circumstances as their contributions to the Paris Agreement. Despite of what was just said about let's not look too much into the NDCs and their negative message, I'd like to pose a question to Axel. At the moment, what countries have put on the table in terms of their NDCs, when that's added up, that only takes us 1/3 to what is needed for staying below 2 degrees of global warming. That's the limit considered as the limit of dangerous global warming. However, some say that staying below 1.5 is what is needed. That's a question of survival for many small island states. At the same time, many say that this is no longer feasible. We've run out of time. Axel, what kind of policy instruments would be needed to stay below 2 degrees or indeed 1.5? You've looked into this recently.
Yeah, thank you very much. If one wants to be 1.5 degree compatible, it means that the world as a whole needs to be fully decarbonized by around 2060. And thereafter, for several decades, we need to have negative emissions. That means we need to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. So that's a huge challenge. And for this, we need a mixture of various instruments. We need market mechanisms, carbon pricing, emission trading schemes, but we also need investment programs for emerging technologies because it's clear that the market will not on its own mobilize those technologies that are still expensive. And we have some experience with market mechanisms over the past 15 years, but the prices in those mechanisms reached values of $5 to $10 per ton of CO2, and that's of course way below the levels that we would need for getting on a 1.5 degree compatible emissions path. And that means we need to have governments in the next 10 to 15 years really take up those mechanisms, accept carbon pricing, also accept emission credits from those countries that are too poor to introduce carbon pricing on their own in order to make this price work throughout the global economy.
So markets. Let me turn to Rudolf on the other side of the coin. So we have the costs of mitigation. We also have the costs of loss and damage and of adaptation, making countries resilient. And Rudolf, you're an expert in strategic foresight. You've looked at these issues in the longer term, and I understand in particular in the area of climate resilience and investments in infrastructure. Broadly speaking, how would a world in which we remain below 2 degrees, how would it look in terms of what would the investments in resilience need to be in that case? And how about if we go over 2 degrees, what is the scenario then? And more specifically, are there any particular areas where you think that there will be a specific need for investments in resilience?
A specific need or perhaps a specific opportunity. Actually, my primary answer to your question is tied directly to our speaker's emphasis on urbanization. And nowhere is this more true in the Middle East, where 85% of the population, 90% of the infrastructure, tremendous amount of the economic activity is in coastal cities. So not just urban environments, but urban environments that are in coastal areas. Boy, you're right about the feedback loop. And so our analysis suggested that, quite frankly, regardless of where we get in terms of temperature increase, that there are investments in coastal city climate resilience that are likely to be exceptionally robust. And by the way, not just robust with respect to climate change, but many of the investments in routing technologies, coordinating technologies, build resilience also from a national security standpoint in case of conflict, in terms of food and water security. So the urban environments that are able to make investments in resilience with respect to climate are going to capture much larger scale benefits as well. Now that's true in the region, but it's also true globally. 17 of the 25 largest cities in the world are in coastal areas. And so to the extent that, for example, investments in the Middle East in coastal city climate resilience are successful, there's a global market for the solutions in terms of infrastructure, technology. And central to all of that is the fourth industrial revolution. And many of us may have some issues with that name because it includes so much, but at its core are opportunities to build connectivity to the flow of people, materials, ideas that are more resilient, more flexible, and can be optimized, from sensing the environment, having real data about how things perform, but also routing them optimally. And so if you consider not just hard, big infrastructure, the kind of infrastructure that the Netherlands invested in with incredible foresight 30 years ago, realizing their own sea level challenge, but the next generation of innovation in the fourth industrial revolution, I think there will be huge returns to investment in coastal city climate resilience and investments in which this region is already taking a very aggressive stance that will have a global market in the future.
Thank you very much. I think we've addressed most of the areas that I suggested, I outlined at the beginning, the 4 ways in which climate change and the economy interact. We have 5 minutes left only, so that leaves our panelists each with 1 minute to address a final question that I have, an area we haven't touched upon yet, which is very relevant for this region. We know that staying below 2 degrees of global warming will require for a large share of fossil fuels to be left on the ground. Should the world's fossil fuel producers, including in this region, should they feel threatened? And if not, why? I'd like to start with Axel.
Well, I would think that the fuel producers should look into the chemical industry. It's clear the chemical industry will always require some petrochemical feedstock, and therefore the value added can be increased in that path. Whether this is sufficient to overcome the loss of business just selling these fuels as a fuel, that I cannot judge. But at least the early movers can generate new fields of business. And of course, here in the region, you also have assets as oil producers that can be used for renewable energy production. And you will certainly have a higher competitiveness. You have empty spaces, you have high insulation. So, of course, translating your revenues into renewable energy production might also be a strategy.
Thank you, Axel. How about Rudolf?
I'd like to passionately agree with Axel. Across 2 different scenario studies on this topic, focusing on petrochemicals proved itself to be exceptionally robust. It serves not only the interest of using hydrocarbons differently, but it also serves economic diversification purposes. It builds on expertise that these countries have. invaluable and unique expertise, which for the fourth industrial revolution is going to be crucial to building clusters. You've got to build it around something that you know how to do exceptionally well. In this region, petrochemicals fits that mark. So that's the most robust solution to this challenge that we've seen. Is it a threat? Fundamentally, the countries in this region are so well aware of the oil future that they're already making the adaptations radically, and now it's a question of how to optimize it economically.
Thank you very much. Sebastian.
I mean, it's pretty much what my colleagues have said. I mean, basically, I mean, the region where I live is one of the regions that we have a massive reservoir of non-conventional oil and gas. What that means that perhaps we'll never get this out, basically. And but we know that, and everything depends on the demand and price, of course. But we do have a lot of resources. So transport and electricity, that's not going to be the question. So the point is how to move from that fuels towards the petrochemical. That's for sure. Not forever, because I don't believe that that will be needed for a long time. For the future, basically, but yes, for the short and mid time. So everybody is aware on that, and most of the countries are already adopting the economies for this to happen, basically. So I'm not seeing this as a tremendous impact to leave resources underneath, but we have to be prepared.
Very well.
And this is critical, and this is crucial for that.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Obviously, I may agree with colleagues on the panel, but I want to make another point. I mean, when you look at the UAE, they started looking at this issue way beyond, before it was popular. So, you know, when did we start with World Future Energy Summit? I think it was 2009 or something, and they took IRENA to be headquartered here. They competed for that in 2010. You know, we moved here in 2011. So I think there is a foresight and thinking about this that it is not necessarily linked to the current, the last 2 years. And when you look at beyond the UAE, some of the most competitive prices in auctions are set by companies like ACWA Power from Saudi Arabia, and the benchmarks on the solar PV and the CSP increasingly are set in this region. So I don't think there is, I think there's a very foresighted thinking about this that it goes way beyond what we are discussing here.
Very well. And finally, to close off, Michael, opportunities, threats.
Well, so I think if you take a 20-year view, and you know, the fossil fuels will still be used in large volumes. Petrochemical industry will be dependent on the petro bit of the petrochemical. The chemicals industry will be dependent on the oil industry. It's very helpful to have a low cost structure. Even within that 20 years, there'll be volatility, which means if you're the high cost producer, there'll be years when you're not making money and years when you are. It'll be a lot better for this region, therefore it's a good thing because the cost base, the variable cost of extraction is low. You go beyond the 20-year period, and I think that fossil fuel producers should be very threatened, or very, I don't know, threatened is the wrong word, it implies there's somebody doing a threat, creating a threat, but they should be very, very concerned, because it's not just that some of the trends on the demand side in energy, in transportation are clearly just moving away from them. But it is also that reliance of the chemical industry on the oil feedstock. I mean, can you conceive of a world where in, let's say, 50 years, our chemicals industry is still dependent on fossilized swamp goo? It's unthinkable with the level of improvement, with the tools that Rudolf talked about in terms of being able to manipulate molecules, understand outcomes, modeling these very complex chemical reactions. And these molecules, they're essentially carbon and hydrogen and energy, which we have from the sun, and brains, and enabled by these tools. So I would be very, very concerned about a national strategy that does not do the sorts of things that Abu Dhabi started to do here a decade ago. And I think it is a huge, success is not assured even here. I would still, I'm optimistic here, but it's still risky. But if you look at other fossil-dependent countries, they should be very, very concerned in that 20-year to 50-year time frame. If they've not made transitions by then, I think that a very poor outcome is going to follow.
Right. As we hear, it's a very complex issue. And I think we've heard incredibly rich insights from our experts today. I think one of the key messages that comes through that there's need for far-sighted thinking. There's also need for very fast action to seize all the opportunities we've heard about today, including in this region. I would like you to join me in thanking our panelists for this discussion, and I hope that you'll continue the conversation with them afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you.